Today is March 13, 2017, and it is the beginning into the evening portion of the 15th day of the 12th Hebrew month, which is the last day of Purim. And we're investigating this feast and the Book of Esther and other similar type feasts that are mentioned either in the Bible or in apocryphal writings that are not in Leviticus 23. So before we begin, let us ask our Heavenly Family to guide us. Eloheinu, Heavenly Family, thank you so much for giving us principles whereby we may come to a knowledge of reality as it is. Please help us to learn to use these principles rightly. Help us to truly understand this subject so that we can do the right thing and so that we can witness to the world. Thank you so very much. And guide us as we continue to discuss and study this out. We ask this B'Shem Tzemach Huahi, in the name of branch, he and she. Amen.
Amen.
So I'll recap a little bit of our discussion yesterday, and then we will get into continuing on that discussion. So, in past Purim studies that we've had over the last several years, we have talked about the different versions of the Book of Esther. We've read through the Book of Esther together, trying to understand what it says and that sort of thing. But this time, we are approaching things in a slightly different way. Of course, 2 nights ago, we had a meeting which was primarily focused on the celebration of the victory or the defeat of Nicanor in 161 BC. And that follows just before the 2 days which are designated at the end of the Book of Esther to be the days of Purim, that being the 14th and 15th days of the 12th Hebrew month. Although we've mentioned that the Book of Esther does also make mention of the 13th day, and even being a day for commemoration, but at the end, it doesn't seem to be included. So it's a little bit, the edges of Purim, in a sense, are blurred. The 14th day is there for sure, but then there's also the 15th, and then there's the 13th, and they're all kind of included. But we had our discussion on the 13th, again, focused on the events of 161 BC, as recorded in 1 Maccabees 7 and 2 Maccabees chapters 14 and 15, dealing with Nicanor and his threatenings against the Jewish people and subsequent defeat at the hands of Judas Maccabeus and his troops. And we've been trying to approach all these things in such a way as to test them according to reality. We have been, to some extent, observing these days, and what we mean by observing is simply we've been coming together to have meetings on them and to study the history which they commemorate. Although there are some things in the traditional observance of these days that we have not yet done, and possibly will never do. For instance, Purim has an aspect of sending gifts to one another at Purim. And we have not actually ever done that, and one of the reasons is that we are actually counseled through the message of Victor Houteff not to give love gifts. Not to give time gifts, but only to give love gifts. And that's in Tract 13, if anyone wants to look that up. So we've been kind of, questioning how should we view these days, and how should we view the writings which speak of the events commemorated by and on these days. Do they claim inspiration? Does that have an impact on the validity of the observance of these days? Or does it not? And there's a series of questions that kind of follow from that. And we've been, last night we discussed what those questions are and kind of went from point to point, and different people chipped in. And it really was kind of showing us, okay, well, what do we include? I mean, we have many different days. Of course, we have the feasts mentioned in Leviticus 23. They are also repeated in the Pentateuch in Numbers 28 and 29. But there's also mention of new moons. And some people just keep the feast days in Leviticus 23 and don't keep new moons. Others also keep new moons. Well, expanding beyond the Pentateuch, there are some other days mentioned in the Protestant Bible, and primarily, really, it's just Purim in the book of Esther, the Feast of Deliverance. But then there's another holiday that rabbinic Jews keep, although it is not in their canon, and that is Hanukkah. That is spoken of in, all first, second, and fourth book of the Maccabees. Third Maccabees does not actually deal with that same history. And so Jews have that in their tradition to keep Hanukkah, although they do not have the story of Hanukkah in their Bibles. Catholics, Eastern Orthodox Christians, Greek Orthodox, the various Orthodox Christian denominations, and basically almost all of Christianity other than Protestants have at least first and second, and many also have third and fourth Maccabees in their canons, or at least for Catholics, their Deuterocanon. It's a second canon. And so they have that in their Bibles, the reference of Hanukkah, the story of Hanukkah, the record of the institution of the annual observance of those days, and even also a reference in the Gospel of John in the New Testament to Jesus going to the temple for Hanukkah. So, interestingly though, even though these various Christian denominations have that in their sacred scriptures, they do not observe the days of Hanukkah, which isn't too much of a surprise since they also don't observe Purim and the festivals mentioned in Numbers 28 and 29, along with Leviticus 23. And then, of course, we have another day of observance mentioned in 3rd Maccabees, which commemorates the deliverance of the Jews in Egypt under, I believe his name is Ptolemy Philopator. And I would have to go and check the time again on that, whether it's 2nd century BC or 3rd century BC, sometime around there, maybe even 1st century, but it's within those last few centuries before the Common Era. And there are very, very few people out there who observe that day which is it's the Feast of Salvation, or also it could be translated the Feast of Deliverance. And it is the date that's given for that feast is actually according to the Egyptian calendar, which is perhaps why many people do not observe it, even if they have it in their Bibles. So that's another day that's mentioned in the ancient writings of the Jews. But there are even more days. The Book of Jubilees mentions several annual days to be kept by the Jewish people. Some of these are, the first day of the first month, the first day of the fourth month, the first day of the 10th month, and so on. Beyond that, we have writings such as the Temple Scroll, which mentions feasts which kind of are very reminiscent of the feasts that we read in Leviticus, and they seem to be part of a similar system or the same system. And what it introduces is another feast 50 days after Pentecost. It's another harvest festival. And then another feast 50 days after that. So we have the festival of new wine and the festival of new oil. Those are those harvest festivals that are at intervals of 50 days following Pentecost. And then after that, there's a festival of wood offerings, which, though it is not mentioned in the Pentateuch, is mentioned, or at least the wood offerings and offering wood offerings according to the law of Moses is mentioned in the book of Nehemiah. And in some of the Pentateuch fragments, or scholars refer to as reworked Pentateuch, there's at least one reworked Pentateuch fragment found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, which references wood offerings as well. And it's very much so like the Temple Scroll. So we have all these different days in our, I'll say in the writings of the Jews, which are available to us now from ancient times. And then, of course, we could also extend this discussion to talk about other annual commemorations that have been appointed, or annual times, in more modern history. For example, Davidian History Day is on October 25 every year. It was instituted in the days of Victor Hotteth. It's clearly not commanded in Leviticus 23, for instance, or in Numbers 28 and 29, and it's not anywhere in the Bible, quote unquote. And, of course, it is even based on or operate within a calendar which is foreign to the Bible. So that's an interesting aspect to consider. And then, of course, even though we didn't discuss this much last night, Lois Roden introduces an autumnal Pentecost. And so we studied that on the last day that the autumnal Pentecost is. In other words, there is a seventh-day Sabbath during the Feast of Tabernacles. The day following that seventh-day Sabbath starts a 50 count, leading us up to what is the parallel day to the day of Pentecost in the spring, but it is in the fall. So just as in the spring there is the seventh-day Sabbath in the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and then counting from the first day of the week following that seventh-day Sabbath, 50 days, brings you to Pentecost, just so Lois Roden introduced the idea that there is a similar day, 50 days following the first day of the week, which comes immediately after the seventh-day Sabbath in the Feast of Tabernacles. And I say she introduced it in the sense that she brought it forth as something to observe. However, Victor Hotteth was the one who first mentioned the idea to my awareness. I'm not aware of any prior reference in all known literature to such a day or such an observance. So, what do we do with these days? And some of them are different in character, and I will suggest that each one needs to be investigated on its own merits. Even for me to say, what do we do with these days, has a tendency to cluster together all these various days simply because they are other than what is in the Pentateuch. But again, that itself has an implication of, well, here's the Pentateuch, and then there's everything else. Well, I could do the same thing with, okay, well, what do we do with all these days, but starting from the reference point of 3rd Maccabees and the day referenced there? Of course, that wouldn't seem too usual for any of us. We might think, well, why are we just looking at this day referenced in 3rd Maccabees and kind of using that as our reference point and then grouping all the other days in together? But the only reason why we might think that is odd is because of the process of canonization of Scripture, along with the process of attribution of the writings of the Pentateuch, that is the first 5 books of quote-unquote the Bible, to Moses. So, in all of this, I want to encourage us, and I want to mention some additional things to what we talked about last night. It's very important for us not to group things in together like that. For sake of discussion, it's helpful for me to reference all of these other days other than what's in the Pentateuch because we are most familiar with the ones in the Pentateuch. But I stress that I am not mentioning them as kind of a collective, so in such a way as to group them together as being similar in character. The fact that we are more familiar with the feasts referenced in the Pentateuch does not mean that all the other ones are of a different character. In fact, if we do look at each feast on its own merit and try to categorize them according to their character, it may look very different. You could try and categorize it according to periods of time and when things were supposedly instituted and so on. Or you might categorize it according to the claim of who instituted this feast for each particular feast. So, for instance, if you say, oh, well, we want to categorize things according to character, and we are looking particularly at the time period when something is supposed to have been instituted, well, then you could say, oh, well, things which were from the time of Moses include the feasts mentioned in Leviticus and Numbers, and also the feasts mentioned in the Temple Scroll, because they claim to be given by Yahweh through Moses. So that's also claiming divine inspiration. But that is the claim as it is found, on one hand, in the Temple Scroll, and on the other hand, in Leviticus 23 and Numbers 28 and 29. But that claim is not necessarily shared in such a specific way by all of the texts in question. The Book of Jubilees, for instance, places the observance of many of these days, including the Feast of Tabernacles, for instance, long before the time of Moses. It brings them back into the patriarchal days, and it connects certain ritual purifications that took periods of time, even as far back as Adam and Eve. And it even connects some of these days to going even further back, even what might be considered pre-fall history, and that they were written on the heavenly tablets, and then they were revealed to humanity progressively as time went on through the patriarchal period, and then finally climaxing with the festival of Passover, which was, of course, instituted in the days of Moses. Okay. Feasts which are not mentioned as being part of the law of Moses, but which claim an origin for their institution with divine command. Well, we do actually have something like that. For instance, the Autumnal Pentecost, Lois Roden claimed a revelation concerning it as being an appointed time, and she said that it's kept in heaven. Well, that's an interesting claim. That is claiming some sort of divine origin and divine basis for keeping that particular festival. Well, you look at other ones, though, and, well, this doesn't necessarily have a claim to a divine origin. For instance, we have the Feast of Hanukkah, the Feast of Purim, the celebration of the victory over Nicanor, the feast mentioned in 3rd Maccabees, and they all were appointed by the people as a commemoration of that time. It's not to automatically degrade it because of that, but it's to say that is actually a characteristic difference. Those feasts share that characteristic, and that is not shared by the Autumnal Pentecost, the other harvest feasts mentioned in the Temple Scroll, the feasts of Leviticus 23 and Numbers 28 and 29. So, again, we need to look at each one on its own merits and not try to group it in our groups. If we simply have, well, here are the Pentateuchal festivals, the festivals mentioned in the Pentateuch, and here are the non-Pentateuchal festivals. We have to understand that all that means is that the ones in the Pentateuch are the ones that we are more familiar with, the other ones are the ones that we are less familiar with. It's not saying that they are of a similar character to each other just because we have categorized them according to our familiarity with them. So, again, that said, I am wanting you guys still to, question all these various aspects, and that was the primary purpose of last night's discussion, to ask the questions and to encourage you guys to ask the questions and to seek for answers and that sort of thing. Some of the things that I've said now in introducing this discussion tonight are for the purpose of kind of organizing our thoughts a little bit more and actually giving some of what will hopefully be instructive counsel in regard to how to go about investigating this sort of thing. So, that said, does anyone have any comments or questions so far in what has been said?
We're pretty much just soaking up and listening. So there's nothing to say because this is like all, sorry, it's all Greek to me.
Well, then you should have a few things to say, perhaps. That's a good comment. Okay. Well, anyone else? Anyone else here and with comment, perhaps?
That was really good. Maybe I'll pass along some things that Mary had said.
Sure.
So she contacted us earlier to say she has, standing appointment on Monday night study, that sort of thing. And she did share some thoughts, though, concerning Purim, that being that it does seem questionable for a few reasons. And one of the reasons she mentioned was the fact that it seems like maybe the Jews that were in Persia at that time actually were in disobedience being there, because they should have returned to help rebuild the temple. They shouldn't have still been there in the Persian Empire. And so that was an interesting comment. Do you remember what else she said about it?
Yeah, and then she also, of course, mentioned the aspect of the gifts again, I believe.
Right.
If I'm remembering right. And I think those were the two main aspects that I'm remembering. But I think it's an interesting point to say, hey, were those Jews there? This is one of the aspects we talked about last night. If one of the factors as to whether or not we should keep certain feasts is that it is part of our history, we have to define what we mean by our. And is our just simply the Jewish people? Is it the Israelites? And I think that all of us would say it's not just Israelites in general. And if we define it as Israelites, that's only as Israelites up until the division of the kingdom into the northern and southern kingdom. And at that point, it continues on through the Jewish people. And if that principle is to be applied all the way along, then we're defining our by the group of people who kept up with present truth at various periods of time. And they would follow each other in succession, each being, in a sense, a subgroup within the prior group. Well, how about during the time of Esther? Were people like Esther and Mordecai and so on, were they part of that subgroup of present truth followers in their own day? And so the aspect that Mary mentioned may be taken, at least, to indicate that perhaps they weren't, because they hadn't returned, and God's people were called to return in order to rebuild the temple. And yet, this is after that call had been made, and they are still scattered among the Gentile nations. And I'll look up here Susa, which is where Esther was, and find out a little bit more on that. At the same time, an aspect which is worth considering, it's very possible that some may have desired to go back and been unable. So, for instance, you might have someone who was just a child at the time of the return of the exiles. There were several returns that took place, and it was essentially groups of Jews coming back at different times. I think there were 3 or 4 primary trips home, as it were. And there may have been a child who was living at that time who wanted to go back and who wanted to follow the truth, or perhaps they didn't know any better, but then they grew up and followed the truth as much as they knew, but they're still out there in exile. So they could still, be a sincere follower, although that still perhaps might put them outside of that main group. Other than we know that there was a degree of communication between Jews in the diaspora in other words, outside of the land of Israel, and those inside of the land of Israel in the Second Temple period. And so someone may have been outside of Judea and yet be a part of the community of Judeans who returned, at least in thought. Perhaps they would have accepted the messages of Zechariah and Haggai, that is, once those messages reached them. Perhaps they received it. So in other words, it's not, necessarily tied to location, although the location would certainly put someone in contact with the present truth faster. Okay, so Susa, according to the Holman Illustrated Persian Empire, the territory is now in modern Iran. Cyrus made Susa a capital city along with Ecbatana and Babylon. When Alexander the Great captured Susa, he found a large treasure that he confiscated. Archaeologists have excavated Susa largely around 4 areas: the royal palace, the Acropolis, the royal city, and an artisan tell. Some believe Susa to be the place where Queen Esther and King Ahasuerus ruled. Okay, so that is basically a little bit of info on Susa, which is where the book of Esther is set. So, I wanted to, of course, read that simply so that we would know, okay, well, where exactly was this? Of course, it's outside of the land of Israel. And I should also see if we can get a more exact date on Purim. So I'll look that up here as well. Something that I'm seeing here is saying the year 473 as the time when Purim was first celebrated. Okay, so that is before the time that Ezra arrived in Jerusalem in 457 BC. In other words, it's before the command to restore and rebuild the city of Jerusalem, but it is after the decrees to build the temple. Okay.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So that gives us a basic time frame. So the temple itself was completed in 516 or 515 BC. And so that was, again, through the ministry of Haggai and Zechariah, and their ministry stirred up people like Zerubbabel and Joshua the high priest. And so that continued on for a while where, hey, the temple was established, but the city still was very much so in ruins. And so it had to be restored as well, and that the decree to rebuild and restore it did not come until after the time of the institution of Purim. So that gives a little bit of a time frame, but this is after the primary returns from exile. So anyways, that's showing us that, okay, so the people who were in Susa, the Jews that were there, including Mordecai and Esther, they evidently were not among those who returned to build the temple. But depending on how old Esther was, it may have been that she didn't have much of an opportunity because, again, the temple was actually finished in 516, but Purim was not until 473. So we actually have a decent period of time between those two events, and that could easily account for people outside of the land of Israel who are honestly following the truth, and even what was present truth in their day, but who simply had not had opportunity to return to the land. Not saying that that demonstrates that they were the true people of God at that time, the people in Susa, or Esther and Mordecai in particular, but it just to say that the absence of them in the land and the fact that they were elsewhere does not automatically disqualify them from being believers in present truth in their own time. So there are a number of elements to factor in our search for this. And so again, what we're really trying to determine is what is the correct way to view Purim in particular, but also some of these other festivals with which we are less familiar. Again, we can't really group them all in and deal with them as a group, but we can see some characteristics that are shared by some of them. So, for instance, if we study the validity of Purim, the principles involved in that are going to be much the same as those involved in, let's say, Hanukkah, or the victory over the victory over Nicanor. Those feasts share a common characteristic in that they all celebrate a deliverance of God's people, of the Jewish people in particular, and they were instituted by the people. So those are similarities. Obviously, studying these, or any one of them, won't really inform us of the validity of the feasts of the Temple Scroll. Those have to be judged entirely separately. They're very different in character. They are based on different claims, both concerning the feasts themselves and concerning the sources which describe those feasts. So, for instance, the Temple Scroll claims to be a product of inspiration. And it also claims that the feasts mentioned within it were given by inspiration. In contrast, the book of Esther and the books of the Maccabees do not make an overt claim to inspiration that we have been able to discern, and they certainly don't make a claim for some sort of divine origin of these feasts, that is Purim, Hanukkah, and the celebration of the victory of Nicanor, or over Nicanor. So I think one of the things that might be good for us to do, even though we won't be able to go through all of Esther right now, we can briefly investigate what it claims concerning itself. Does it make any obvious claim to authorship? Does it make any claim to inspiration? Those are some questions that are good to ask, and then we can go from there to see how is that relevant or not relevant to the validity of Purim, or how one might view Purim. So, does anyone have any thoughts as to how we might go about investigating whether Purim claims authorship, or attributes its own authorship to a particular person, and in connection with that, whether it claims to be a product of inspiration?
What does Esther say?
Excellent.
Seemed
Yeah,
like
we should go to. We should go to the Book of Esther to check that out. Go ahead.
Seemed like it was Mordecai that suggested that from my memory, but maybe not.
That suggested what?
Suggested that they have a celebration day to remember what happened.
Okay. Well, for the Book of Esther itself, first we want to focus on that. Mm-hmm. Where might we look in the Book of Esther to find out whether it claims to be authored by a particular person? And also, where will we look within the Book of Esther to find out whether it makes any obvious claim to inspiration?
You're talking about the book, the whole book, not just Purim.
Yes, I'm talking about the Book of Esther.
All right.
So I agree with you that, yes, we should go and look at the Book of Esther to see what it claims concerning itself. That's certainly what we should do. But is there anywhere where we might look in particular, that and any place within the Book of Esther that might be expected to give us an answer to our questions?
Generally, the first part of the book tells who its author is.
Or the last.
Or the last.
Yeah. Okay, so the first part or the last part of the book. So that's a really good place to look. Like if we want to see, okay, well, who wrote this? Let's see if it tells us. So let's keep that in mind. And the reason why I've asked both questions together, again, the two questions are, first, does this claim any specific authorship? Is it written anonymously, or does it claim to be authored by a specific person? That's the first question. The second question is, does it claim to be a product of inspiration? In other words, does it claim to be a message from God or to be written by a prophet or anything like that? The reason why I asked those two questions together is, of course, because if it does claim to be authored by a specific individual who it names, and if that individual was known to be a claimed prophet or something like that, well, then that would also answer the question for a claim of inspiration. So they do relate in a sense, or at least those two questions under the right circumstances are very much so related, although in other circumstances they are not necessarily related. So let's look at the beginning of the Book of Esther. Now, what is, of course, of much consequence here is the fact that there are two ancient versions of the Book of Esther. There's the long version, preserved in the Greek Septuagint, and there's the short version, preserved in the Hebrew Masoretic text. And they both begin differently. So first I will read the introduction, the first part of the Book of Esther, according to the long version of the Book of Esther. And you guys can let me know if this claims to be authored by a particular person or if it claims to be a product of inspiration. So I'm going to just read the beginning, and then I will read the ending of the Book of Esther as found in the long version, and we'll see if that indicates something as well. Okay, so beginning of Esther, long version. In the second year of the reign of Artaxerxes the Great, on the first day of Nisan, Mordecai, son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, of the tribe of Benjamin, had a dream. He was a Jew living in the city of Susa, a great man, serving in the court of the king. He was one of the captives whom King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon had brought from Jerusalem with King Jeconiah of Judea. And this was his dream. And then it goes into Mordecai's dream. So, so far in that, what do you guys think? Is there anything within that claims authorship by a specific person or claims inspiration for the origin of the book?
This tells the time frame and the place.
That's certainly true. So does it claim inspiration? Does it claim to be authored by a specific person?
No.
No, okay. I would agree with that. I don't see anything here that makes any sort of claim to be authored by a specific person or to be a product of inspiration.
I will make note of one thing, though. It's written in such a way to indicate or at least suggest that it is not written by Mordecai.
That's certainly the case, yes. It refers to Mordecai as someone other than the author. So it's telling a story from a narrator's perspective.
In fact, the whole book is.
Yeah, that's the case. I don't know any time where it says I, so on and so forth.
Except for when quoting, and it introduces it that way. So we could read the whole story, and according to the way it's written, we could deduce that none of the characters in the story claim to be the author.
Yes.
I'm looking in my Bible, and it says Josephus thought that Mordecai wrote the book.
Okay, perhaps Josephus did think that. Of course, in reading Josephus, I guess we will find out for anyone of us who does read all the writings of Josephus. So that shows us the first part of the book. How about the last part of the long version of Esther? This is how the long version of Esther ends. In the 4th year of the reign of Ptolemy and Cleopatra, Dositheus, who said that he was a priest and a Levite, and his son Ptolemy brought to Egypt the preceding letter about Purim, which they said was authentic and had been translated by Lysimachus, son of Ptolemy, one of the residents of Jerusalem. And prior to that, there was a letter, which I believe, let's see. I'm wondering if this is one of the letters from Esther that is mentioned earlier in the book. But I'm not entirely sure, because the section prior to this is, Mordecai's dream fulfilled. And it says, and Mordecai said, and it gives a long quote. So we'd have to look at that more. But reading that ending anyway, is there anything that you can see in what I read here? This is, again, the ending part of the long version of the book of Esther. Is there anything which claims to be a product of inspiration, or anything which claims authorship by a specific individual?
No.
No, I would certainly agree with that. One of the things that is interesting about this, though, and this can be looked into more another time perhaps, it talks about Ptolemy and Cleopatra. Well, this is indicative of the time of the writing of this book, the Book of Esther. Obviously, if it's referencing that something happened in the 4th year of the reign of Ptolemy and Cleopatra, well, then obviously this was written at some point after that event, whether in the same year or in years following. But it certainly would have to be written after that. And let's see. Yeah, I think that was in the 2nd century BC. The time of Ptolemy.
They reigned in Egypt, didn't they?
Yes. Yeah. So, very interesting, because at least the long version of Esther then would not have been written until the 2nd century BC. And so if the short version is the older version, well, it may have preceded that, but if the long version is the original version, then the Book of Esther comes from after the time of Ptolemy and Cleopatra, or at least from within their time. Okay, so that's as far as the long version goes, but again, we have 2 ancient versions. So, let us look at the shorter version, which is the more well-known version to Protestants. And we'll read the beginning and end of it to see if there's anything which indicates specific authorship or a claim to inspiration. So I'll read from the NET. So this is the beginning of the short version of the Book of Esther. The following events happened in the days of Ahasuerus. I am referring to that Ahasuerus who used to rule over 127 provinces extending all the way from India to Ethiopia. In those days, as King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in Susa, the citadel, in the 3rd year of his reign, he provided a banquet for all his officials and his servants. The army of Persia and Media was present, as well as the nobles and the officials of the provinces. And it continues on. So does that contain a claim to inspiration or a claim to authorship?
No.
No, okay. Yes, I'm not familiar with anything within this that makes either of those 2 claims. Okay, so I will read now the end of the short version of the Book of Esther. Again, this will be the version that most Protestants have in their Bibles. So this is Esther chapter 10. King Ahasuerus then imposed forced labor on the land and on the coastlands of the sea. Now all the actions carried out under his authority and his great achievements, along with an exact statement concerning the greatness of Mordecai, whom the king promoted, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? Mordecai the Jew was second only to King Ahasuerus. He was the highest-ranking Jew, and he was admired by his numerous relatives. He worked enthusiastically for the good of his people and was an advocate of the welfare of all his descendants. Okay, so that's the ending of the short version of the Book of Esther. Does that make any claim to authorship or to inspiration?
No.
No. Okay. So far, we have no indication within the book of Esther that the writing itself, the book itself, claims to be a product of inspiration, nor do we have anything within the book of Esther that we are aware of which makes the claim that it's written by a particular person. So, of course, the beginning and end are the places where we would seek to find something like that. Of course, with authorship, it's going to be most likely at the beginning or the end. A claim to inspiration could be scattered somewhere else within the writing. For instance, in some of Paul's letters, there are claims to inspiration in the midst of the letter. But it's also there by implication at the beginning and end because of the claim to be written by Paul. So in our readings of the book of Esther, both the short version and the long version, going through the whole thing, that is, I do not recall anything at any point within the book of Esther which makes a claim to divine inspiration or to being authored by a specific person.
Mm-mm. In fact, in the short version, there's no mention of God at all.
Yes, there's no specific mention of God. Specifically, it does not mention the name of God, Yahweh, although there is reference to Esther praying, which implies that she's praying to God. But that's just by implication, and it's very much so secular in how things are described in the short version of the book of Esther. The long version is certainly more religious in nature. It talks about visions, it talks about God and keeping the Torah and dreams, that sort of thing. Okay, so that's that as far as that goes. Within the book of Esther, it talks about these days, the 14th and 15th days, and I just wanted to read the passage or passages, at least some of them, that describe the institution of these days, just to see if they do make any sort of claim to be appointed by inspiration. So let us see. All right. In Esther chapter 9, verses 15 to 21. And I may even read beyond that. Actually, I'm going to even... I'm going to go forward a little bit. I'm going to start from verse 17. On the 14th day, they rested and made that same day a day of rest. They is the Jews in the kingdom. So that's in verse 16. It says, now the other Jews in the kingdom gathered to defend themselves, etc. Then verse 17, on the 14th day, they rested and made the same day a day of rest, celebrating it with joy and gladness. The Jews who were in Susa, the capital, came together also on the 14th day, but did not rest. They celebrated the 15th with joy and gladness. On this account, then, the Jews who are scattered around the countryside outside Susa keep the 14th of Adar as a joyful holiday and send presents of food to one another, while those who live in the large cities keep the 15th day of Adar as their joyful holiday, also sending presents to one another. Mordecai recorded these things in a book and sent it to the Jews in the kingdom of Artaxerxes, both near and far, telling them that they should keep the 14th and 15th days of Adar, for on these days the Jews got relief from their enemies. The whole month, namely Adar, in which their condition had been changed from sorrow into gladness, and from a time of distress to a holiday, was to be celebrated as a time for feasting and gladness, and for sending presents of food to their friends and to the poor. So the Jews accepted what Mordecai had written to them. And then it goes on. So, according to this, who is it that initially appointed these holidays?
They.
That's right. The Jews who had the deliverance. They said, man, okay, let's just keep this from year after year. Let us do this. And then Mordecai also advocated the keeping of it according to the book of Esther. And so he sent a writing to the Jews throughout the kingdom of Artaxerxes, both near and far, telling them to keep the 14th and 15th days of Adar. Now, something that's interesting is that when it talks about the Jews in verses 16 to 19, it doesn't seem to be that all of these Jews kept both days. Those in the large cities kept the 15th. Those in the countrysides kept the 14th. And then it says that Mordecai sent some sort of writing to Jews in the kingdom, telling them that they should keep the 14th and 15th days of Adar. Of course, one could interpret that to be saying that he was telling them to keep both days, or it could be understood as him telling them to keep the days, and along with that, it being implied that still those in the cities would keep the 15th, those in the countries would keep the 14th. In either case, is there a claim here that this feast was something that was given through the inspiration of the Spirit of God?
No, it was given by the thought of their own mind, which could have been inspired. We don't know that.
Okay. Yeah, so it's something that is not, specifically claimed to be given by God. Of course, the book of Esther does claim that Mordecai was used by God in some sense, and in the long version, it even implies that Mordecai received a dream, and that dream came to pass. Of course, that is not in the short version. Go ahead.
Even if Mordecai did have a dream that came to pass, that wouldn't make him an inspired messenger, because we've had more than one person in our group have dreams inspired by our Heavenly Family, and none of them are inspired messengers. So anyone who had that sort of dream in our group, if they were to appoint a day, it would not at all be divinely appointed unless it was, unless they could prove that somehow. But it seems to be completely out of the realm of the way our Heavenly Family works. When there's a messenger, with a message, then they're the ones through whom the message is given, and then there's other things that can be shown through other people as well, but not in relation to the message.
Good points, Teresa.
I was wondering where they came up with the sending food thing, whether that was a Persian way or why they tacked that onto their celebration.
That is a good question. It doesn't, really say. Let's see here. Okay, so, it's interesting because they, at this point, the Jews who were there in Susa and scattered throughout had lived there for quite some time. It's rather interesting, actually, that the book of Esther claims that Mordecai was one of the Jews that Nebuchadnezzar took. Now, the thing that's interesting about that is that Nebuchadnezzar came in, he took Jews captive at different points, but I believe that the last time that he took Jews captive was in the year 586. That's when he destroyed the temple. And so that was the last time that he took Jews captive. And Purim, this first Purim, was in the year 473. So that would mean that Mordecai would have to be, well over 100 years old at this point. That's kind of interesting. If he was taken, so he would have lived, if that's all historically accurate, and he was actually taken by Nebuchadnezzar and lived to this point, he'd have to be over 100, because again, the last time that Nebuchadnezzar took Jews captive was in 586, but this event of the deliverance of the Jews in the days of Mordecai and Esther took place in 473. And so if that's the case, if that's historically accurate, Mordecai would not have known any other life but life among the Gentiles. And so he wouldn't have had any memory really of Jerusalem, the temple, and all of that. So this is just kind of to get a little bit more of the context of this and the feel for this. So he would have been certainly an old man at this point, and Esther would have lived her whole life away from the land of Israel. And thus they would have been totally embedded within the Persian culture. And whether there was a gift-giving thing going on there or not, I don't know. But it wouldn't have come directly from something going on in Jerusalem, that's for sure. Whether they just decided it or not, who knows. But one thing that Teresa has brought up, this is an interesting point, and that is that Victor Houteff teaches against giving gifts simply because it's a time to give gifts, time gifts rather than love gifts. So I want to talk about that a little bit, but before that, I just want to point out that so far we have every indication that Purim was not a divine appointment. Now, that doesn't mean automatically it's discredited and disqualified as something that we should keep. Or what I should say is, it doesn't necessarily mean that. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's disqualified. That's one of the things to question. And let me ask you guys, what do you think? Do you think that just because it's not of divine appointment, that it automatically means that it should not be kept?
No.
Or, okay, that's good. You're giving an answer, no. And why is that?
Because God gave us a power of freedom to choose. We can choose to like something and do something, or to remind us of God's intervention in our lives, or we can choose not to. If it's important to your life, well, it's good to remember it, or your nation's life. It's history.
Well, that could be. But at the same time, I'll say that our freedom to choose does not evidence the moral rightness of our choices. So
right.
God giving us the freedom to choose doesn't mean that our choices are right. So someone still could choose, hey, I'm going to appoint this day and it's important to us, but that doesn't mean it's right. And, for example, the 10-tribe kingdom, and particularly Jeroboam, the leader of the 10-tribe kingdom, the first leader, that is, they appointed certain days to be kept. And those days were actually not to be kept by the true people of God. And just like we have other days that we are not supposed to keep as branches and Davidians and so on, whether it's Christmas or Easter or birthdays or what have you. And yet those who keep them, of course, keep them because they believe it's in some way important. And we might say some of it is based on history, whether it's the birth of an individual, whether it's, whichever version of the history of Christmas one goes with, whether they trace it to entirely pagan origins or whether they trace it to the birth of Jesus, as some who keep it do. They're basing it off of something, but that doesn't mean that it's right. And the fact that they have the freedom to do it if they want to also doesn't mean that it's right.
But that was against God's commandment when they did that, though. God did command the right way to do it, and they were going against it.
Well, what if someone says, oh, well, we'll do both?
No, God said that worship should be done at Jerusalem, keeping the feasts and things that He commanded. That's where His house was to be the head.
Okay, so that's certainly the case when it comes to the days appointed by Jeroboam. But how about things like birthdays and Christmas and Easter and stuff like that? There's no specific command in ancient scripture that I'm aware of which says, do not keep Christmas or do not keep birthdays or something like that.
So that would be all right to do that. You don't want to go against God's express command.
Right, so definitely don't want to go against God's express command, but just because God did not specifically prohibit something, does that mean that God allows something?
Well, the 10 Commandments gives guidelines too that we shouldn't make things that go against them.
Okay, so just how about this? The law of Moses condemns male homosexuality, but it does not condemn female homosexuality. It is silent on female homosexuality. Does that mean that female homosexuality is right just because it is not specifically prohibited in the Mosaic law?
Well, it prohibits it in the New Testament, which is patterned from the Old Testament.
Right, but how about before then?
Well, just common sense tells you, it's wrong for men to do it. Women are men also with a womb.
And that was specifically how they viewed it in the ancient world. But what you're saying, though, is, when you say it's common sense, if it applies to one, it should apply to the other. That makes sense in that you're not looking just to the letter of the law, you're looking to the principle of the law. And that's what Paul brings out in Romans 1, and that's why he condemns female homosexuality, because the same principle which applies to male homosexuality also applies to female homosexuality. And so that's just an example to say that a lack of specific prohibition against something does not equate to condoning that thing. So sometimes also a prohibitive statement comes in response to a wrong, rather than there being a command and then someone goes against it. So when we come to something like Christmas or Easter or birthdays or whatever, things like that, we have no command in ancient scripture against those things, but those things have become more and more prominent. And then in modern scripture, again, defining scripture as writings which have come about as a product of inspiration, we do have command against some of those things. So that's particularly in the writings of
I read somewhere where Christmas trees came about back in those days. They would hang, when they would have a war, they would hang their conquered people they killed, their heads on the Christmas tree. That's where we got the ornaments, and their intestines around the tree. That's where we get the other stuff to put on the tree. That was in one of the books on old time, where some of these symbols and things come from. That's
so there's, I'm not sure if those specific details, are historically accurate or not. I'm not trying to say that they're not. I'm just saying that I'm personally unaware of whether that's actually the case or not. However, I will say that there was no Christmas tree before Christmas. And Christmas, as we know, Christmas did not come about until after the time of Jesus. So, for instance, like there's the verse in Jeremiah chapter 10 that some people take to be referring to the Christmas tree or whatever. Well, obviously it can't be referring specifically to the Christmas tree because Christmas did not exist yet. However, the Christmas tree has ancient precedence to it. It's a new version of something which came before. And so Jeremiah refers to something that could be considered a proto-Christmas tree, something which is a prior manifestation of something that is similar to a Christmas tree in a previous generation. And then a Christmas tree is something which is different. It is something that is a different manifestation of that same sort of thing. So our phone is about to cut out. Yeah, something like that. So our phone is actually about to cut out. We have less than a minute, so we're going to have to hang up and then call back in. And then we'll try to wrap up the meeting here. So anyway, we'll be right back. Okay, we are back now. Thank you for waiting. So there are a couple other things that I want to discuss before we end the meeting, but I want us to keep in mind to go in the direction of bringing it to an end so we don't go on too long. One of the things that Teresa mentioned is that Victor Houteff speaks against time gifts. This is in, again, track 13, Christ's Greetings. And you guys can study that and read his statements in regard to that. Now, here's the thing. The book of Esther evidently is in favor of sending time gifts, at least on Purim. Victor Houteff was clearly against time gifts. So here's the question. By which are we to test the other? In other words, some may say, well, I'm going to test Esther by Victor Houteff's statements. And someone might say, well, I am going to test Victor Houteff by Esther. Those are two different perspectives. So which is to be used in order to test the other, and why?
We could test him easier. We could read and see what his reason for being against time gifts was.
I have to say that is a very good answer. That even goes to the second, to what was going to be my follow-up question. You're going actually to what ultimately is the heart of the matter. So that's really good, and that, in a sense, is a shortcut right to it. But I'm going to expand a little bit more. So here's the thing. Ultimately, it's not about testing one according to the other. But I wanted to ask that question because it highlights something, and I want to explain what that is. And then I'll comment a little bit on what you said, Leroy, because that addresses the higher principle, which is ultimately what we need to go to. So here's the thing. Some people would say, well, obviously, you need to test Victor Houteff by the book of Esther because the book of Esther came first. So you test what came after by that which preceded it. Someone else might say, well, obviously you are supposed to test Victor Houteff against the book of Esther because the book of Esther is in the Bible, and Victor Houteff is subject to the Bible. Now, it was interesting for me how yesterday when Teresa mentioned the idea of love gifts and how Victor Houteff speaks against them, she was saying that, and it was obvious that the implication is that, well, there might be something wrong with the book of Esther or with Purim. And what's interesting to me is that no one said, hey, now wait a second, shouldn't that mean that there's something wrong with Victor Houteff because he's saying something that seems to be against the book of Esther, which is part of, quote-unquote, the Bible? Now, it's very interesting to me that no one did that. And once Teresa made that statement, I was immediately glad. The reason why is because it showed me that her and presumably at least however many of you on the call, perhaps all of you, did not operate automatically within a canonical framework to say, oh, well, simply because this has been collected into a library which is accepted by a certain community as being the inspired authoritative scriptures, the canon, Just because of that, it must automatically be true, and thus the thing by which all things are to be tested. You guys either didn't do that, or if you did, you were silent about it. Which, if you did actually think that way and were silent about it, I'll say, hey, you know what? Next time, maybe it's a good thing to say something, because if you think, hey, wait a second, Teresa is saying something, but she should be saying the reverse. She should be questioning Victor Houteff rather than questioning Esther, because Esther's part of the Bible. Then I think that it would be good of you to say that, because someone would be thinking wrongly. You would have had the opportunity to say, hey, wait a second, I don't think that's right. I think this is the right way. And you would have not done it in spite of the opportunity. But perhaps it's the case that all of you are at the point of understanding where you recognize that just because something had been compiled centuries after the time of Jesus into a canon doesn't mean that it's automatically right. The book of Esther was one of the most controverted books to be accepted into the rabbinic canon and to be accepted into the various Christian canons. Many people didn't think that it was inspired. And now we can see perhaps why, because it doesn't make a claim to inspiration. And even the Masoretic version isn't even particularly religious. So you can see why the rabbis and the sages in rabbinic Judaism would have really debated, oh, well, should this really be included? Should we consider this to be scripture and all of that? Because it's not, really religious, at least the version of it that they had. The other version, while it mentions some religious aspects, it clearly was written, the Greek version was clearly written centuries after the event, and it doesn't really, claim specific authorship or inspiration or anything like that. Yet, in both communities, it ended up being accepted. Perhaps because people really like the story. And there's not really something that's very much like that. I mean, there are things that are perhaps similar. There are, for instance, other stories, like in the book of Judges, for instance, of dominant female characters and things like that. Deborah, for instance. But this is a book which is focused on Esther. There's not much like that, in ancient Jewish writings. And it's a enjoyable story to read and all of that. So it may be that both communities just liked the story, and so they accepted it and endowed it with a divine status. But that doesn't mean that it actually has a divine status just because a couple communities endowed it with such a status. So because of that, we can't simply say, well, it's in the Bible, therefore it is to be the thing by which something else is tested. No, because we've realized that something being in a particular collection of writings that a particular community has does not say anything about its value and its character. All it means is that people considered it to be something.
It was
That's
about
one
the
aspect.
Jews and other people's hatred of them, so...
Yeah, you could see how it would be important for some Jews because, hey, it's part of the history of the Jewish people and so on. So that's one aspect about canon. Another aspect is something coming first automatically indicative of the fact that other things are to be tested by it? Well, of course not. You could say, well, look, in ancient times, you have the Egyptian civilization and culture and Egyptian writings, Egyptian religious writings, from before the writings that are in the Bible. Well, just because they came first, does that mean you're supposed to test the writings in the Bible against them? Well, no. That doesn't make any sense. Also, you have certain conceptions. The idea that the earth is the center of the cosmos. Well, that came, quote-unquote, first in history so far as we know. Well, how about the idea that the earth actually goes around the sun? Is that automatically false just because it came second, or just because there's an idea that came earlier than that one? Well, no, that doesn't automatically make it false. You could say, well, Joseph Smith, he came and started his prophetic ministry before Ellen White came and started hers. Is he automatically right and she automatically wrong just because he came first? No. So something coming first does not automatically mean that it is the thing by which the other is to be tested. Now, there is a sense in which it is correct to say that we should test Esther by Victor Houteff, but that is contingent upon another thing, and that other thing is what Leroy was ultimately referring to. He was saying, well, we could look and see what Victor Houteff's reasons were, and so on. Well, that means testing Victor Houteff's claims. And if we can test Victor Houteff's claims and find that they are in accord with material reality, and really, if you look at his reasons for objecting to time gifts, they are good reasons. He is not against gift-giving, period. He's against the idea of giving a gift simply because it's an appointed time to give a gift. And he
a form of slavery.
A form of slavery. Yeah, it's basically compulsory, and people are expected to give a certain gift. Whether they genuinely want to give it or not is totally beside the point. It's just, it's time to give a gift, and so therefore let's give a gift. And ultimately, the reason why people continue with that custom, often, Christmas rolls around, people don't want to have to go and buy gifts for other people. But people just keep up the custom because, hey, they want to receive the gifts that other people are going to give them. So that's ultimately a selfish reason. And it ends up being vanity. It's like useless things. People spend money on things that are not really good financial decisions. People waste money to get things that will then waste their time. Usually, I'm not saying that every Christmas gift that someone gives is a useless gift or anything like that, but just saying that in general, that's the way it ends up being. And then you have the social dynamics and people becoming depressed if they don't receive gifts or if they don't receive the gift that they want. How many kids complain with receiving the wrong gift? Why? Because they know it's Christmas and they have an expectation, or it's their birthday, and they feel a sense of entitlement and a right that they are going to receive something and it better be what they want. And if they don't get that, well, then they have a complaint. Well, that's just wrong. And the fact of reality is that Christmas does promote those expectations and those very immoral states of mind because of the compulsory gift giving. The time gifts and birthdays, it's the same principle is at work. And so Victor Houteff's objection to that is certainly valid. Moreover, if you look at Victor Houteff's broader claims or his more specific claims in other areas, his prophetic claims, the claims of his message, and you find that he is a true messenger of our heavenly family, and that he's speaking counsel from our heavenly family, well, then that is weighty. That is important. And we can test their counsel and find that it is good and find that it is reliable. And if we find that one of their inspired messengers gives counsel and we know it's from our heavenly family, well then, it is entirely fair to test something according to that. Why? Because we know it is true by experiment. And so, it is entirely fair to test Purim according to things that Victor Houteff said, even though Victor Houteff came after the fact, because the truths which Victor Houteff taught apply to all time. You know, the objection to time gifts was just as true back then as it is now. And so it's entirely fitting to test the legitimacy of giving such time gifts according to the principle which Victor Houteff taught. Time is, in a sense, irrelevant to that because it applies to all time. It doesn't matter when something was said. The truth, as Ellen White said, the truth is eternal, and conflict with error will only make manifest its strength. So that's the principle. So here's the thing. In looking at that, we can say, okay, look, it looks to be, according to the book of Esther in both of its versions, that Purim had as part of it time gifts from the beginning. I don't know of any other record. So, unless there is further information which would show that to not be the case, every indication that we have right now, all the evidence shows Purim to have time gifts as part of it from the beginning. And so this kind of is an interesting aspect because we know time gifts to be contrary to the instruction of our heavenly family. So here's the thing. If we just look at the fact that it does not claim divine inspiration for itself, that being Purim, there's no claim of Purim as being an institution by God. That in itself would indicate that Purim is not required. So there's nothing that we have from inspiration or from the story of Purim that would indicate for someone who wants to do the things that God has told us to do, there's nothing to indicate that God has told us to do that, and there's nothing to indicate that it is required to observe the festival of Purim. But that in itself does not say anything against keeping Purim. For instance, Jesus obviously went to the, again, and hey, this is something that someone could question, and it would be good to question it. When the Gospel of John talks about Jesus going to keep Hanukkah at the temple, is that historically accurate? In the Synoptic Gospels, it only talks about Jesus going to Jerusalem one time, and that was for the Passover, basically for the Feast of Unleavened Bread, during which he died. So some people say, the Gospel of John isn't really historically reliable. Jesus really did go to Jerusalem only that one time, and he died, and he didn't go to Jerusalem any other time. That's not historically likely. Jesus was a Jew living in Galilee. It's very likely that he went. Just from that fact alone, it's very likely, it doesn't prove that it happened, but it's very likely that he would have gone to Jerusalem to keep the feasts throughout his life. Now, there is actually indication of him going more than once in the Synoptic Gospels, just not during his ministry specifically. And that, of course, in the Gospel of Luke, we have him going at the age of 12 for Passover. And we have actually shown in previous studies that that scenario of the 12-year-old Jesus is actually historically probable, that that actually happened, in which case he went to Jerusalem to keep feast as a young boy and so on. And very likely he would have gone also for Hanukkah with his family. Not only that, but of course we have the record of his parents going to Jerusalem in the Gospel of Luke as well, which again is also historically likely. And then we also have the connection between Jesus and John the Baptist, which is evidenced in multiple writings. And John the Baptist did a lot of his work in Judea. No, not exclusively so necessarily, but Jesus evidently did some work around there and had some sort of connection with John the Baptist, who had his primary work in Judea, not in Galilee. So that also brings a connection between Jesus and being in the Jerusalem area at various times in his life, not just the Feast of Unleavened Bread in which he died. Moreover, even in the Synoptic Gospels, it does say some things which indicate that Jesus knew people in Jerusalem prior to that week. There are things, for instance, where he, for Passover, he says to go into the city and, go to a certain place and you'll meet a guy, and basically that's where we're going to have Passover. Well, reading it, it naturally implies that Jesus knew the people there. Well, how would he know the people there? Well, it stands to reason that he would have traveled to Jerusalem and met them and known them, and he had been in that room before, the upper room and all of that, and knew the people who owned the building and that sort of thing. So all of that is to say that it's John's account of Jesus going to keep or going to the temple for the Feast of Hanukkah is actually quite likely. Like the weight of evidence is in favor of that idea, and the thoughts that people would have to the contrary aren't really historically substantiated. The objections to Jesus going for Hanukkah are not really substantiated. So all of that is to say that would be an example of Jesus keeping a feast which is not specifically commanded by God. So it's just to say that it's not necessarily the case that just because something isn't commanded by God, it is automatically wrong. Just like if something isn't prohibited doesn't make it automatically right. So again, not prohibited does not equate to right. Not condemned does not equate to wrong. Not commanded does not equate to wrong either. So, for instance, we have no command in Scripture to put on socks in the morning. But it doesn't mean that it's wrong to put on socks just because it's not commanded. There are plenty of things that are perfectly fine to do and even good to do that we are not commanded to do. Ellen White talks about how the angels were surprised to find out that there even was a law, a divine law. So they obviously weren't commanded to keep certain precepts and all of that. And it didn't mean that it was wrong to do something just because it wasn't commanded. So just because Hanukkah is not commanded doesn't mean that we should not celebrate Hanukkah. So that's all to say that... Go ahead.
I forget what Hanukkah is.
Hanukkah is the celebration of the restoration and cleansing of the temple in the time of the Maccabees.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So, Hanukkah, that's something that Jesus evidently observed, and I don't know of anything that's wrong with keeping Hanukkah, that's for sure. Okay, so as far as Purim goes, we can say it is not required to keep Purim, although the fact that it is not required does not necessitate that we shouldn't keep Purim. But Purim has this other element to it, which is the element of time gifts, which makes it share that objectionable characteristic of birthdays and Christmas. And so the question is, and I'll ask you guys what you think of this, sharing that characteristic, and since that characteristic of time gifts is a reason not to keep things like birthdays and Christmas and that sort of thing, does that imply that also we should not keep Purim? What do you guys think?
Well, we don't have to do the time gifts part of it. We can commemorate it as part of our history of the Christian church.
Okay, now, would that then imply that, we can keep Christmas and just not do that part of it, not do the time gifts part of it, but we can keep the other elements of Christmas?
No.
So that wouldn't imply that?
Christmas has other reasons why it's not fit to keep.
Okay, that's good. So basically, there are additional reasons. So how about with Esther or with Purim? Are there additional reasons? Additional aspects of Purim which are objectionable?
No.
Okay, can't think of any additional reasons. And so with Christmas, we can say, there are additional reasons why it isn't necessarily a good idea to keep Christmas. But maybe there aren't additional reasons why, or additional aspects of Purim which are not good. In which case, maybe one could say that it's fine to have that aspect of Purim, or to keep other aspects of Purim, whatever that might mean. But again, as far as actions, the whole idea of, maybe resting, celebrating, and eating and exchanging gifts, those seem to be the primary aspects of observance in terms of action for the festival of Purim. But commemorating the event or getting together and studying it or remembering it isn't necessarily wrong. That's not automatically objectionable. Whereas Christmas has at its root many objectionable features in addition to gift giving, and that has to do with the history of Christmas, and basically it's not something that's based on truth, in that, that's not actually Jesus' birthday anyway, and it's also based on stories which themselves, like even the Christian version of Christmas, may not actually be something that is based on historical fact. So
it's a lie.
Yeah, exactly. It may be just, to keep Christmas in any form. Now, how about birthdays? Is there anything... Sorry, go ahead.
It has people lying to their own children about Santa Claus and stuff like that.
Well, I mean, that's one aspect, yeah. But, I mean, there are plenty of people who keep Christmas without Santa Claus. Like, in my family, I was never taught to believe in Santa Claus, but we always kept Christmas. And, you know, even though most of it was actually secular, there was some element of Jesus, you know, and the birth of Jesus involved in it. So,
did you wait till first thing Christmas Day to open up your presents, like the Santa Claus story?
Well, we would wait until then to open the presents from the one side of the family, but we would spend Christmas Eve with one side of the family and Christmas Day with the other, and we would open the gifts related to those sides on the respective days.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but hey, and here's the thing: even though we didn't believe in Santa Claus, well, guess what? We would still watch the movies. You know, the movies that told that Christmas story with, you know, about Santa, and then there's the reindeer, and, you know, all of the different things associated with Christmas. Basically, we would still keep Christmas as any secular person would, and Christmas is primarily a secular holiday today. Right. We would do all the things that they would do. It's just we knew that it's, you know, that Santa wasn't real, and hey, a lot of secular people know that Santa's not real too, you know. Even children, you know, however many of them are not raised being told that lie, however some of them are, and religion has nothing to do with that one way or the other, ultimately. Yeah, so here's the thing. So Christmas has, you know, some objectionable features in it no matter what. You know, whether it's just the time gifts aspect or going beyond that, the secular, you know, Santa Claus lies that are perpetuated through it, or even what I was referring to is that the events upon which it is based may also not be historically true. This comes to our other studies that we've had concerning the gospel narratives of the nativity scenes, the nativity of Jesus. You know, we've questioned the historicity of those events, and so far have not been able to find anything which would indicate that those things actually happened, and some things which actually seem to indicate the contrary. So even the Christian version of it may not be based on truth, both in terms of the time of year and the events which were supposed to have happened. And then, of course, you have the connection between Christmas and Saturnalia and, you know, different pagan holidays and all of that sort of thing. So really, there's nothing that can be determined to be truthful about Christmas. Birthdays, also, we could ask the same sort of question. Is there anything other than time gifts which is objectionable to birthdays? Well, I would say, yeah, there is. And the reason is basically when children grow up with birthday celebration and all of that, it really just encourages selfishness and self-focus. You know, even if you don't do the gift thing, it's still, oh, this is all about me. This is a me day.
So same as Christmas.
Yeah, in a sense, depending on the version of Christmas you're talking about. But Christmas is not necessarily focused on me, other than the gift-giving element. It becomes a me thing. But
we expect the gift.
Birthdays, right, but birthdays, what I'm trying to say is birthdays apart from gift-giving even. It's all about me. And this is why in the Church of Satan, birthdays are the holiest day of the year for the individual, because Satanism is actually all about selfism. Selfism is really what it is. Not all Satanists even believe that Satan was a real being. They think that maybe it's a metaphor or whatever. So, the modern Satanist movement is not even necessarily theistic. Although, of course, there are theists in it, but it's primarily about self. The Satanic Bible, its number one commandment is this: it's do as thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. That's a common Satanist saying. Do what you want, basically. It's all about you. Gratify yourself. Do what you choose and what you want to do just because you want to do it. You are the focus. You are the center. And that's why, for them, birthdays are the biggest holiday or holy day above any other appointed time, annual celebration or anything like that. Birthdays are the number one. Why? Because birthdays are all about the self, all about the individual. So that's, an objectionable characteristic of birthdays aside from time gifts. So with Purim, I don't know if there's anything objectionable other than the time gifts. There's another element that Mary did mention. She said that there is question in Mary's text concerning Purim that she sent us, that Teresa mentioned earlier. She mentioned that some question the historicity of the events of Purim. So that would be good to find out. If the events described in Esther actually just didn't happen, like if this is basically just a fiction that someone made up at some point, well, then it's basically useless to get together to even study the history of Purim and to commemorate, that's a great thing that happened, that preserved the Jewish people and so on, if that didn't even happen. So if we find out that Esther is not historical, then it's basically useless to, get together on those days and that sort of thing. However, if it is historical, there's nothing inherently objectionable about getting together at that time and rejoicing over the fact that God delivered the people, that the Jewish people were preserved once again, even though, once again, there was a genocidal threat against them.
There's going to be another one of them, and faith comes by hearing.
Faith comes by hearing. That's certainly true. And when you say another one of them, are you referring to a genocidal threat against the Jewish people?
Against people that believe in the Sabbath, Sunday law.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I mean, so there's, if it's historical, well, hey, then it's worth studying. And no matter what, the book of Esther being part of what was accepted in various canons and so on and so forth, it's something that's worth studying no matter what. As far as Purim, if basically gift-giving, time gifts are an integral part of it, this is another element too. We have to ask, if gift-giving is an integral part of it, even if that is the only objectionable aspect of it, one question to ask is, can it be separated from the whole? Can one actually keep Purim, observe the day without gift-giving, if gift-giving was an integral part of it from the beginning?
Is there a difference between celebrating or between celebrating and commemorating or remembering?
Depending on how you define the terms, yes or no. But what we can say is that one could consider it in their mind as a holy day or as an appointed day or as a kind of a big deal, and it's something that, on this day I'm going to keep various traditions. And that's one thing. And another thing is someone could say, hey, you know what? I think it's worth the time once a year to look at the book of Esther and consider what lessons we might learn from that history, or even just taking the time to study to find out whether or not it is historical. One could go about doing that sort of investigation and say, hey, I'll take the time on those days to do that because that's when it happened, but not necessarily considering it as keeping Purim. It's just studying Purim on that day, and if it turns out that it's a historical event, then there's nothing wrong with rejoicing in the fact that they were preserved.
Amen.
In fact, that seems like something worth rejoicing over. So, with that in mind, sorry, go ahead.
And just weeding out all these things that are not historical, not wasting our time on them. Like, I got rid of Christmas just because I was still paying for last year's gifts when it come time for this year. And I said, man, I can't, this is terrible. I just quit it because of that.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So here's the thing. I will suggest a proposal as to how we should approach Purim, and I'd like you guys to kind of respond and let me know if it sounds reasonable and fair and if you think that that is a truthful approach concerning our present knowledge. So this is what I propose. I propose that we do not consider Purim to be a holy day, a day set apart by God, because we have no evidence that it is a day set apart by God. In fact, we have evidence that it was a day that was set apart by Jews living in Susa in the year 473 BC. And so, for that reason, we should not consider it a requirement to in any way observe or even necessarily remember the Feast of Purim or the event which it commemorates on these days each year. It should not be a requirement. It should not be anything like that, because it's not something which our Heavenly Family has made a covenant with us to keep or anything like that, like it is with other feasts. And so there's nothing inherently, it's not like it's a moral issue where it's inherent that it should be kept as a moral issue, and it's not like there's a covenantal basis for it. So we are in no way required to keep Purim.
It's not also part of our salvation.
Well, that's certainly the case. So also, it's important to recognize that Purim has an element of it that is certainly objectionable, and that is the element of time gifts. And just as that is an element of birthdays and of Christmas that keep us from observing it, likewise, it is an element of Purim that should at least keep us from observing it in the sense of following the example of those who, so far as we are able to tell, originally instituted it. So what I mean by that is, so far as we are able to tell, the aspect of gift-giving was an integral part of Purim from its beginning. And so what they would have considered to be keeping Purim is something that we cannot participate in. And in that sense, we shouldn't keep Purim if we are to consider gift-giving as an integral part of it. However, studying the historicity of the events which Purim commemorates is certainly something that is worth doing, and there would be nothing wrong with gathering at that time to study it, to find out, did this really happen? So what I'm proposing is that next year and potentially the years following, but this is dependent on what we find. So next year, Purim comes around. We don't feel it as a requirement to keep it or to observe it, but my proposal is that we get together at that time to study whether or not the events are historical, and potentially whether or not we should entirely separate from Purim just because of the gift-giving element. In other words, that's something that's still a question. Should we entirely separate from it because it had gift-giving as an integral part of it? But that kind of depends on the historicity. I mean, if it's not historical to begin with, well, then it wasn't an integral part of it from the beginning in the sense of from the event described, because there would have been no event. It would have been just a later manufactured fiction. And then people would have, at some point later, ended up believing that fiction and incorporating the keeping of the gift-giving and all of that later on. So
God's wonderful providence. God's wonderful providence was certainly manifested in it, if it's historical.
Well, right, if it's historical. So my proposal is that next year, at this time, we get together to study whether or not it's historical. And one of the questions that we will have in mind is that even if it is historical, should we get together again on those days, basically because there's a potential that the gift-giving element as part of it, the time gift element as part of it, should cause us to separate from it entirely. In other words, even just gathering on those days for the specific purpose of studying it may give the appearance of Purim observance. And if Purim observance is wrong because of gift-giving as being an integral part of it, then basically we should separate from it entirely. In other words, it's kind of like, if it is an integral part of it, then basically we would have to revolutionize the idea of Purim in order to say we're still keeping Purim in some sense, but we're not keeping what anyone could identify as Purim at any point in history, and so we are inventing a novel idea that Purim observance is something other than what it has always been. And at that point, we may as well not call it Purim, and we may as well not to get together on those days because there would be no reason to. So if we study and find out that it is historically accurate, but that the gift-giving element cannot be justifiably separated from it, then at that point we will entirely separate from Purim and not have meetings on these days anymore for the sake of Purim. I mean, if we happen to have a conference call on that time, no big deal, but it may be on another subject. Likewise, another question that we'll ask is, are the events of Purim actually historically accurate? And if they are not, like if there was no deliverance and was no threat in the days of Ahasuerus and all of that, well, at that point, we may as well not keep it either. So we have different options. Either we get together, we study it, we find out that it's not historical, and therefore we stop keeping it. And at that point, the book of Esther becomes relatively unimportant, although maybe still important for some reasons, even though it would have to be recognized as a fiction, but it would be important for understanding the history of religious thought. And that would basically be it. The other option is that we get together, we study it, we find that it is historical, but that we should separate ourselves from any appearance of observing it, in which case the book would be useful, Esther would be useful for history, but would not be useful for edification necessarily, because it promotes something that we would be in a disagreement with, and thus we would not keep Purim in any way in years following. The third option is that we study it, we find that it is historically accurate, and that there is a justifiable reason to separate the gift giving from it. Like, let's say we find out that originally there was no gift giving as part of it, and it's not an integral part of it. Well, then we would still get together and celebrate the deliverance of Purim, but wouldn't have the other elements attached to it. So those are all different options, but it is all dependent on studying it more. And because we have so many other things to study, we're not going to drop our community rule studies and our other studies just to study Purim. So it makes sense that when it comes around again next year, we get together to find out, is it historical, and go from there. So that is the proposal. What do you guys think of that?
I even think not necessarily studying it for 3 days might be all right too.
Well, I mean, that is contingent upon what we find in our studies, though, right? So,
right.
Does it make sense that next year we would have these meetings again, and we would study this both for Purim and, when it comes to the celebration of the victory over Nicanor, that's another thing to revisit again and to study. But again, there's not like an inherently objectionable characteristic of it in terms of like time gifts or something like that, like we find with Purim. But the thought is next year we'll have meetings on these days again in order to study further, particularly with Purim, the historicity of the event, and then decide from there based off of the principles and so on that I have kind of enumerated here. Does that sound like a reasonable approach? And what I'm asking is in regard to all the things that I just laid out, not regarding Purim as a holy day or a day that was given by God, and not regarding it as something to be required. And then further, keeping in mind that it may be that we should entirely separate from it in every regard, but it may also be that we should not, but that is dependent upon the historicity of the event and also whether time gifts are an integral part of it. So that's the whole idea. So I'd like to know if you guys think overall that is a good approach to take toward Purim.
Sounds reasonable to me, and maybe I'm mistaken about the 3. Maybe one of the days was Nicanor, and then the other ones was Purim.
Right.
I'm not understanding. Yeah. Sounds reasonable to me.
Okay, cool. How about others of you? What do you think?
I agree.
Okay, wonderful. Anyone else?
I have a question.
Sure.
If we hadn't already made a decision about keeping Christmas, would we come together on Christmas and study about Christmas on Christmas to see if we wanted to keep it the following year? Or would we study in between that time so that when it came the next time, we would say, no, we're not going to do it anymore? Or we are going to do it some more, So I'm just wondering the principle of it.
Sure, that is a very good question. I do think that it does make sense to study it in between if we have the time to do that. So this is what I'll say. If anyone wants to take the time to do that, I'm totally on board with that. I don't know if we'll end up doing it together on the call simply because there are other things that are more important to study. But at this point, I don't see anything wrong with getting together on the day to study it because it won't be getting together to observe it as a day. Like, it's not like we'll be getting together to keep Purim at this point because we're not sure if it's something that should be kept. And so in a sense, it's just for convenience to get together at that time. In other words, like there are things that are more important to occupy our time on the conference calls, at least in the meantime, and then basically when it rolls around again, it will automatically come to our mind, and at that point it'll make sense to say, okay, well, it's here again, maybe we should have another study on it. But again, if we want to kind of pursue this as a discussion on Facebook or something, that's totally fine. It's not. I'm definitely not suggesting to withhold studying it for a year, but I'm just thinking that it's probably not worth it to take up conference calls to study it until we get to that point. But if we can determine what we should do before then I think that would be great, and then we would know either like, yeah, let's get together and actually celebrate this deliverance even without the time gifts, or basically let's not get together at all for the purpose of studying it. So if we come to that, like if we happen to do that, aside from the conference calls before that point, then that would be awesome. But if not, then I don't see anything wrong with getting together at that time to discuss it further. And I would say the same thing about Christmas. If someone, like let's say you had a family and they weren't sure like about Christmas and they kind of were like, I'm not sure if I should keep this anymore. And then they are just like, let's say they're very, very busy people and they just didn't have time to like really devote to looking into it. It wouldn't be wrong of them when Christmas rolls around again to say, hey, you know what, even though we're not really like doing the whole gift thing and we're not talking about Santa Claus or the birth of Jesus or anything like that, let's, since we have the time off work and whatever, let's just get together and talk about what we should make of Christmas, like we should think of it and try to understand it better. It might just end up being a convenient time, and so they would be able to do that then.
It'd be good for us to be more intelligent about it so we could even explain it to our own church family or other people too, know how to tell why to keep it or not.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, it's definitely good to kind of have an understanding of what we should do in relation to it. But as far as what I said, what do you think, Rebecca? Like, does that kind of make sense?
I'm just trying to understand the principle of it. That's all.
Sure. Yeah, totally. Yeah, basically the principle as I see it is, at this point, since we don't know that it's something we are supposed to keep, it's not something that we will observe as a feast, but we'll look into it more, and it seems that I don't really foresee us having the time to look into it more on the conference calls before next time, but maybe we will. Like, we'll pray about that and consider that, like, maybe as we're approaching Purim next year, maybe we will end up having a study on it ahead of time. But if we don't, I don't see anything wrong with having a meeting on that day to study whether or not it's legitimate. And, of course, in the meantime, like, seriously, if you end up reading up on this more or looking into it, seriously, I would enjoy it if you posted something like maybe on the Branch Davidian SDA Facebook group, something like that, and maybe a discussion would ensue from that, and we would end up being able to determine it ahead of time. Because in a sense, it would be nice to have it determined ahead of time just so that we know, and we could either get together to celebrate it in some fashion or not. So we'll see. We'll see as things go.
The word celebration seems kind of a little bit objectionable to me for some reason. But maybe it's the same
as at all to me.
I think maybe it's to commemorate is the same thing. Maybe just in my mind.
Well, I mean, to me, they mean something very different. Commemorate, you could say maybe it's a form of celebration, perhaps, but I think celebration conveys a different idea. Commemorate, you could commemorate something in a very low-key kind of way, a very calm sort of way. It's not necessarily even rejoicing. It could be a very solemn commemoration.
Or remember.
Remembrance. Yeah, like Remembrance Day, something like that. Like, commemoration can be very solemn, and it doesn't necessarily require celebration, although some commemorations are celebratory. But celebration, to me, when I think of celebration, I think of rejoicing and gladness and,
right.
Eating a good meal and music and dancing and all of that. And I don't see anything objectionable with that. I mean, there are things that are worth singing about and dancing about
right.
and rejoicing over. And so, celebration itself is not an inherently negative thing. Although there are some ways of celebrating things that are objectionable, and there are things that are not worth celebrating. But anyway, I'm looking at the time, and, we've been on for 2.5 hours, and so I really think that... sure, I will say, though, that we should bring it to a close. So, after your comment and, that sort of thing, just keep that in mind.
I kind of missed not having our fellowship meeting because last Sabbath at church really had an exciting time. I wanted to share it. But anyway, it was really a nice, neat Sabbath.
Okay. For sure. And yeah, I know I'm sure several of us missed the social meeting, but we'll get together, of course, and have another social meeting, and we can share our testimonies and all of that. So anyway, I know that it's late and all of that, so would someone like to thank our Heavenly Family, and then we'll end the call?
I will.
Yeah, go ahead, Leroy.
Your Heavenly Family, we thank you for our minds and the joy of using them to research and dig for truth and get rid of non-truths. We pray that you'll be with all of us, give us the victory over our whatever pains or whatever we're going through, and help us to grow into your fullness and stature and be good witnesses for you and hasten the end of sin. Thank you for tonight's meeting. Please accept our praise and our thanks with uplifted hands. In the name of the branch, Jesus' new name. Amen.
Amen.